Continuing the theme of PC ports, I present to you Dementium II HD, a horror FPS released on the Nintendo DS in 2010. The original developer's a renegade kid, but it's been ported to PC by Memetic Games and published by Digital Tribe, who, as you may recall, also published Fortress Craft Evolved. You play as a previously lobotomized inmate at a psychiatric unit for criminals, jailed for murdering his wife and daughter. He suffers from schizophrenia, which causes him to jump between the real world and some kind of hell. You get hallucinations of your wife from time to time, kind of like in Dead Space, and I think the antagonist is an evil doctor who's hungry for souls, or just bored or something. Basically just imagine Shutter Island as written by the work experience guy at Capcom. I'm something of an outsider when it comes to horror in any media, and generally uninitiated enough to shit myself at a token jump scare, or rather I was until I finished playing Dead Space, which depended entirely upon that element. With that said, I struggle to class this game as being notably more horrific than Quake or Half-Life, and it seemingly borrows quite a few elements from both. It seemed to focus most of the horror elements into a single trope, which was to give the player's character a limp. Reassuringly, the limp is only present when walking or crawling and you can run without any hindrance. But before I get too deep into that, I'll take a moment to point out the few nice touches that were implemented. Having failed to beat a couple of the bosses on the first attempt, I noticed that they didn't follow the exact same pattern of attacks the second time round, which made the combat more dynamic and enjoyable, to the point that I didn't mind fighting them again. The map highlighting proved very useful when locating the objective, because the general rule is that it's somewhere you haven't been yet. This one may have been the unintended result of repeatedly reusing the same environments and having you regularly schlep between them, but for most of the game you'll find you need to ration your ammo and medical supplies, which is something that Dead Space 3 completely neglected. Other than that, the credits are skippable. I'll get back to this later. The inclusion of HD in the title of the game could lead to some false presumptions regarding the visuals. Technically, all it requires to be HD is to run in 1080p, and that's about the pinnacle of what Dementium II has to offer graphically. Besides that, you're left to put up with unintentionally voxel-like character models, grainy cutscenes in place of scripted events, and textures that struggle to emulate the original Quake. The soundtrack would probably be alright if it wasn't just a means of telegraphing the approach of enemies, not that they make any real attempt to surprise you in the first place. If memory serves, only one monster actually had the good sense to spawn behind me. The rest of them tend to lurch towards you from the other end of a well-lit, open environment, which isn't exactly conducive towards trying to frighten the player. There's also the sound effects, which are essentially the sound effects from Half-Life 1 recorded on a laptop microphone while playing from a Walkman. The gameplay could do with livening up as well. Besides the aforementioned amount of schlepping involved, you're provided with an incredibly mundane set of weaponry, with the more interesting items only being unlocked near the end of the game, kind of like in Serious Sam 3. The most common enemy in the game can best be described as a chest vagina Bobo doll, and its purpose is, in accordance with the teachings of Chumbawamba, to get knocked down and get up again. There's also a fair share of bullet sponges, but there are 13 different enemies and some of them are quite interesting as well, like the maniacal acid pig. Ultimately though, the level design is poor, and even some of the bosses lack variety, like this amorphous antagonist who is the only boss to appear as a regular enemy later on. I was fighting some kind of witch in a nondescript patch of murk, and halfway through the fight she got bored and buggered off, which didn't do wonders for the rest of the game's self-esteem, and indeed it seemed to lose heart beyond that point with no real difficulty curve or increased pace. To its credit, it didn't drag on for much longer. I completed the game in under 5 hours. As mentioned before, it seems to have a couple of elements from classic FPSs tacked on here and there, like the impotent jump action coupled with an excessively violent grunting noise which you'd find in Quake, along with the use of key puzzles as a central design feature. Unfortunately, the jumping meets a fairly awful section of platforming that also has no checkpoints, so it's no wonder that your character lets out a rattling, desperate sigh every time he makes it to a save point. One more thing of note, doesn't a game where grotesque monsters are appearing in your world by means of shiny floor teleportation and the ultimate objective is to stop this from continuing sound somewhat familiar? Ultimately though, the game's largest source of appeal comes from the fact that it's impossible to take seriously. It's something I've come to refer to as B-movie charm. The story is fairly tedious and the ending is pretty much nonsensical and pointless. There's even an aerosol cannon lighter combination that serves as your flamethrower and unintentionally parodies budget restrictions. But bugger me if some of the antagonist monologues didn't make me laugh. Try this one, for example. Do you even have the slightest idea where you're going, William? You're like a mouse trapped in a maze, looking for its cheese. But guess what, William? The cheese is gone. I had another 2 of those gems picked out, but for the sake of brevity I'll overlook them and bring this to a close. Dementium II HD is a visually poor PC port that's suffering an identity crisis. It attempts to emulate classic first-person shooters, and also strives to be a horror game, but in the end it's neither suspenseful nor action-packed and instills neither fear nor excitement. It's available now on Steam for £9 during the winter sale and would otherwise be $12, the choice is yours.